Let me tell you something about the Deathworld trial that nobody in the Galactic Academy likes to talk about. It has a completion rate of 11%. 11. Not 11 out of 100 candidates. 11 out of every 1,000 who have ever attempted it across the 47 documented species in the Galactic Compact. 11% who made it through the full 72-hour gauntlet on Cathara 9 and came out the other side still breathing, still thinking, still holding whatever piece of gear they were assigned at the start. The other 89%. They either tapped out, collapsed, or had to be extracted by the emergency medic drones that hovered at the perimeter like patient vultures. Nobody died. The compact didn't allow actual death in a training environment. But some cadets came back changed in ways that were hard to explain. Something behind their eyes went quiet. Some of them never applied for field assignment afterward. Some of them transferred to administrative tracks and never spoke about Cathara 9 again. I know all of this because I was the monitoring officer stationed at Observation Post 7 for the 32nd intake trial. I had a seat with a perfect view of the entire southern quadrant of the trial zone, 14 kilometers of hostile terrain, atmospheric distortion arrays, and simulated predator units that the designers had spent the better part of 2 decades making as close to real as physics would allow. I had done this job for 6 years. I had watched cadets from the Vreth homeworld, four-armed, with nervous systems 3 times more complex than a human's, tap out in under 4 hours because the sensory overload became unbearable. I had watched Kalandri cadets, who could literally perceive danger before it happened through some biological precognition mechanism nobody fully understood, still fail to complete the final phase because their bodies gave out from exhaustion, even when their minds knew what was coming. I had watched strong cadets, smart cadets, cadets bred and trained for exactly this kind of ordeal. And I had watched almost all of them fail. So when they told me, 3 weeks before the 32nd intake trial, that the cohort this year would include a human cadet, the first human cadet to ever attempt the Deathworld trial, I did something I am not proud of. I laughed. Not cruelly, not maliciously, but I laughed the way you laugh when someone tells you something that seems so obviously mismatched with reality that your brain just refuses to process it as serious information. A human on Cathara 9. In the Deathworld trial. I had been to Earth twice in my career. Beautiful planet, staggering biodiversity. The humans themselves were fascinating, soft-bodied, completely unarmored, no natural toxin resistance, no enhanced sensory array, no biological redundancies for organ failure. They slept for roughly 1/3 of every single day. They needed to consume water at almost alarming frequency. They experienced something called emotional regulation failure under extreme stress, which from what I understood meant their higher cognitive functions could be temporarily overwhelmed by purely chemical reactions in their bodies. From a purely physiological standpoint, they were not built for what Cathara 9 was going to demand. But I was professional about it. I didn't say anything to the briefing officer when they introduced the cohort roster. I didn't say anything to my colleague Yeth, a Borelian with 20 years of academy monitoring experience, when he pulled me aside afterward and said, very quietly, "The human girl is going to be extracted within the first 6 hours. You want to take that wager?" I said no, not because I disagreed with him, but because something about taking money on a cadet's failure felt wrong, even when the outcome seemed certain. I just went back to my station, pulled up her file and read it. Her name was Senna Voss, 23 years old by Earth standard reckoning. Born in a place called Manitoba, Canada, a northern region of the North American continent, notable for extreme temperature variation, long winters, and a landscape that apparently tested survival instincts just by existing in it. She had grown up in something called a remote homestead, which the file described as a self-sufficient dwelling more than 200 kilometers from any population center. She had learned to navigate by stars before she learned to drive a vehicle. She had spent 2 years in something called the Earth Defense Scout Corps before applying to the Galactic Academy. The Scout Corps file was classified above my clearance, but what I could see suggested she had logged more field hours in hostile terrain environments than most cadets twice her age. Her academy assessment scores were interesting. Not exceptional, not the kind of transcendent numbers you saw from Calendry precogs or Vreth multi-arm combat specialists, but they were consistent, disturbingly consistent. Across 72 separate evaluation metrics, her scores barely varied. She never had a catastrophic failure on any single axis, but she also never had a spectacular peak. The evaluating officer had written a note in the margin of her academic file that I read twice. Cadet Voss displays no obvious ceiling and no obvious floor. She simply continues, I do not have a framework for predicting her performance in extreme scenarios. I am not certain anyone does. I sat with that for a while. Then I put her file away, checked my monitoring equipment, and told myself I was going to watch this trial the same way I watched every other one. Professionally, objectively. That lasted about 11 hours. The morning of the trial launch, Cathara 9 looked the way it always looked before the cadets arrived, quiet in the most deceptive way possible. If you didn't know what the planet was, you might have found it beautiful. The sky ran in shades of amber and bruised violet, thick cloud formations that moved fast and low over the terrain. The ground was a dark, almost black basalt shot through with veins of mineral deposits that caught the light and glimmered faintly. There were plants, not in great abundance, but scattered across the landscape in tough, gnarled clusters, low to the ground, built to survive the pressure variations and the atmospheric storms that rolled through every 18 hours like clockwork. The air was breathable for most compact species, but barely. It sat at the lower edge of oxygen tolerance for humans, which meant every breath was doing maybe 70% of what it would on Earth. Not dangerous enough to require equipment, dangerous enough to matter over 72 hours. The temperature during the day cycles hit somewhere around 42 degrees Celsius in direct exposure. At night, it dropped to roughly 4 degrees, fast. The transition took about 40 minutes, which wasn't enough time to prepare unless you knew it was coming. And in the trial zone, the atmospheric sensors that would normally warn you had been disabled. The cadets assembled at the launch point at 600 station time. There were 31 of them. 12 Vreth, the four-armed ones, powerful, built for combat, visually intimidating even to me, and I'd been around them for years. 6 Calendry, slender, almost fragile-looking, with their distinctive secondary eyelid that gives them that unsettling stillness when they're processing information. 5 Borrelians, Yeth species, stocky, dense muscle structure, adapted for high-gravity environments which gave them a mechanical advantage on any world with standard or substandard gravity. 4 Menhali, aquatic adjacent, with respiratory adaptations that let them function in low-oxygen atmospheres better than almost any other compact species. 2 Thessali. I hadn't monitored Thessali cadets before, and their file said they were from a binary star system, which had produced all kinds of fascinating biological adaptations for managing extreme radiation and heat variation. 1 Keth native, which was unusual. Keth rarely submitted to academy training, preferring their own martial traditions. And 1 human. Senavas stood near the back of the assembled group. I was watching through my long-range optical array, so I could see her clearly even from 7 kilometers out. She was not what I expected, which is a strange thing to say because I'm not certain I had formed a clear expectation. She was average height by human standards, which made her shorter than most of the assembled cadets by a significant margin. She had dark hair cut practically short, the kind of cut that suggests the person doing it thought about function before aesthetics. She was wearing the standard issue trial suit, a flexible, reinforced material that offered basic protection against abrasion and minor environmental hazards, with the Academy insignia on the left shoulder, and she had it fitted tightly, no loose material. She wasn't looking at the other cadets. She was looking at the terrain. She had her head turned toward the southern quadrant, my quadrant, and she was just studying it, the way someone studies a problem they intend to solve, not anxious, not excited, not performing confidence for the benefit of the cadets around her, just looking. The briefing officer, a Borrelian named Hend who had been running trial launches for longer than I had been working at the Academy, delivered the standard orientation, equipment assignment, zone boundaries, extraction protocols. The 3 objectives that had to be completed for full trial credit: retrieval of a beacon unit from the central coordinates of the trial zone, navigation to the extraction point by the 72-hour mark, and completion of the gauntlet sequence, a set of 12 physical and cognitive challenges distributed across the terrain at randomized intervals. After that, Hen said 3 words that I had heard him say 31 times before. Cadets, enter zone. The first 2 hours were always the most revealing. Not because anything dramatic happened, they usually didn't, in the first 2 hours, but because you could watch a cadet's approach to the environment and learn almost everything you needed to know about how they were going to perform. The ones who moved fast, burning energy, trying to cover ground quickly. They were the ones who were going to struggle when Cathara 9 accumulated hostility caught up with them. The ones who stopped too often, overanalyzing every step. They were the ones who were going to lose time and fall behind the pace the trial required. The cadets who made it tended to move in a specific way that was hard to describe but unmistakable once you recognized it. A kind of deliberate, efficient stride that didn't waste motion but didn't sacrifice speed for caution either. They were reading the terrain as they moved, adjusting in real time, never fully comfortable but never frozen. I spent the first hour watching the cohort spread out across the entry quadrant, tagging and tracking each cadet on my monitoring board. About 40 minutes in, I noticed something. Senna Voss had separated from the main group almost immediately after entering the zone. She wasn't moving with any of the clusters that had formed, 3 Vreth together, the Kalandri in a loose pair, the Borrelians in a group of 4. She was alone, and she was moving southeast. Southeast was wrong. The most direct route to the beacon retrieval coordinates was northwest. Every cadet who had reviewed the zone maps, and they all had access to the same basic geographical data before the trial, would have identified northwest as the primary approach vector. Southeast took you toward the ridgeline. The ridgeline was a geological feature that ran across the middle section of the southern quadrant, a sharp elevation change of about 300 meters, rocky, unstable in sections, with exposure to the atmospheric winds that rolled off the higher terrain. It added time. It added physical difficulty. Nobody went southeast in the first stage of the trial unless they were confused or had made some kind of miscalculation. I made a note in my log. Voss human moving SC, assess for navigation error. Then I watched her for another 15 minutes. She wasn't making an error. She was moving with too much intention for it to be an error. Her path wasn't wandering, it was a line. She was going somewhere specific. I pulled up the detailed terrain overlay and mapped her trajectory. She was heading for a narrow pass through the lower section of the ridgeline that the terrain data showed, but that almost no cadet ever identified, because it was marked as navigable reduced efficiency in the standard briefing materials. It was navigable. It was reduced efficiency compared to the direct route by about 40 minutes of travel time. But it put you on the eastern slope of the main approach with 2 things the direct northwest route didn't offer: natural wind cover, and a clear sightline to the Gauntlet Station 3 marker, which was one of the 3 hardest challenge points on the course. She was planning ahead. She wasn't thinking about the next hour. She was thinking about hour 18, hour 30, hour 50. I leaned back in my monitoring chair and looked at her track on my board for a long moment. Then I pulled up a fresh notation file and wrote something I hadn't written about a cadet in a very long time. Watch this one. Hour 6 arrived with a temperature drop and the first of the atmospheric distortion arrays kicking on. This was a planned element of the trial. The Academy designers had built the distortion arrays into the zone specifically to disrupt cadet navigation and sensory processing. What the arrays did, in practical terms, was introduce a low-frequency interference pattern into the air that made visual distance estimation unreliable, caused minor auditory distortions, and in species with biological electromagnetic sensitivity, which included the calandri and the menhali, induced a low-grade sensory disorientation that could range from mildly unpleasant to genuinely debilitating, depending on the individual. For humans, the file said, the primary effect would be headache and a mild vertigo sensation. I watched the array come online across my monitoring board, 13 separate emitter points lighting up in sequence across the zone, and then I watched what happened to the cadets. The first extraction request came in at 6 hours and 14 minutes from a Vreth cadet, one of the big four-armed ones, physically among the most capable in the cohort, who reported that the sensory interference from the distortion array had triggered a stress cascade in his secondary nervous system. The extraction drones were dispatched. Second extraction, 6 hours and 41 minutes. A Borrelian cadet who had pushed too hard in the first hours and was now showing signs of heat exhaustion. In a 42-degree environment with reduced oxygen and distortion interference compounding the cognitive load, it had been too much. Third extraction, 7 hours and 8 minutes. One of the calandri cadets. The distortion array's electromagnetic interference had hit her precognition system in a way that the medical notes described as involuntary sensory flooding. Essentially, her ability to perceive near-future events had been artificially overstimulated by the array interference, and her brain was now processing information at a rate it couldn't sustain. I noted all three with the clinical efficiency of someone who had seen it many times. Then I checked Senna's position. She was in the pass. The narrow pass through the lower ridgeline that she had identified 6 hours ago. She was moving through it at a steady pace, and she was doing something that made me look twice at my optical feed. She was moving with her eyes half closed. Not because she was tired, or at least not primarily because she was tired. I was watching her gait and it was still controlled, still deliberate. She was moving with her eyes half closed because she had realized somehow that reducing her visual input was helping her manage the distortion array interference. She was compensating. The array worked by overloading sensory input channels. If you reduced your reliance on the channels being targeted, specifically visual distance processing, you reduced the array's effective impact on your navigation capability. She had figured that out on her own, in real time. Yeth came by my station at around hour 7. He glanced at my board, saw Senna's marker moving through the pass, and made a sound that in Borrelian roughly translates to mild surprise. "She's still in," he said. "Yes. She hasn't even hit a gauntlet station yet. She's pacing herself. She went southeast first. She's coming at the central zone from the eastern approach." Yeth looked at the board for a moment. "That's a longer path." "By 40 minutes, yes. But she avoids the worst of the distortion array coverage zone in the first phase, and she gets to Station 3 from the low-exposure side." Yeth was quiet for a moment. Then, "The briefing materials don't outline that approach." "No," I said, "they don't." He looked at Senna's marker, looked at me. Then he walked away without saying anything else. I watched her come out of the pass at hour 7 and 40 minutes, step onto the eastern slope of the central approach, and immediately find a position in the shadow of a rock formation that gave her wind cover. She sat down. She pulled the water unit from her kit, standard issue, 12-hour capacity, and she drank exactly half of it, not more. She rationed it precisely, which told me she was already calculating her water consumption against the trial timeline. Then she pulled out the small field assessment unit that every cadet was issued, and she spent 22 minutes just reading data, terrain data, atmospheric data, whatever the unit's sensors were feeding her about the local environment. When she stood up and started moving again, she was heading for Gauntlet Station 3. And she looked ready. Let me describe what Gauntlet Station 3 actually is, because you need to understand it to understand what I watched happen next. Station 3 is officially categorized as a combined physical and cognitive stress evaluation. What that means in practice is a structure, about the size of a small building, that presents the cadet with a series of interlocking challenges that have to be solved simultaneously, while the structure itself is doing everything in its power to make solving them harder. The physical component involves moving through a series of pressure-activated passages that require specific body mechanics. The passages were originally designed for a Vreth body plan and had been adjusted for multi-species use over the years, but they still favored certain body types over others. The cognitive component runs in parallel. While you're physically navigating the passages, a series of logical problem sequences are presented on panels throughout the structure, and you have to solve enough of them within the time limit to unlock the exit. The stress component is that the structure is heated to 65 degrees Celsius internally, not dangerous for most species for short periods. But combined with the physical exertion and the cognitive demand, it creates a cumulative pressure that had broken cadets who had handled the physical and cognitive components easily in isolation. Station 3 had the second highest extraction rate of any single gauntlet point on the course. Senna reached it at hour 11. She stood outside it for about 4 minutes just looking at it. I watched her walk a slow circle around the structure's exterior, examining the entry points, the vent configurations, the material of the walls. She pressed her palm flat against the wall at one point and held it there for a few seconds, feeling the heat of the interior, I realized, getting a physical sense of what she was walking into. Then she went in. I had good sensor coverage inside Station 3. The monitoring system required it. I watched her on the interior feed. The first thing she did when she entered the initial chamber was stop and take 3 slow, deliberate breaths. Not because she needed to calm herself. Her biometrics were already calm, which was itself remarkable. She was doing something specific with those breaths. I looked at the respiratory data and realized she was adjusting her breathing pattern. She was switching to a shallow, controlled breath cycle, the kind that manages oxygen consumption in high-heat environments. She had done this before, or she had studied it. She moved through the first passage section with a fluency that surprised me. The Vreth design passages required upper body strength and flexibility in combination, and I had assumed that would be a limiting factor for a human, but she had clearly prepared for it. She used the wall surfaces for leverage in ways that compensated for her reach limitations, and she moved through the first 3 passages in the fastest time I had recorded for a non-Vreth cadet in 6 years of monitoring. The cognitive panel started presenting problems at the second chamber. I watched her read the first problem, and I watched her face. No stress, no visible frustration. She looked at the panel the way she had looked at the terrain from the launch point, like a problem she intended to solve, not a problem she was afraid of. She answered the first sequence correctly. The second one she got wrong initially, and I watched her take exactly 2 seconds to recognize the error, recalculate, and correct it. 2 seconds. Most cadets spent 30 to 45 seconds after an incorrect answer in a stress recovery cycle before they could reapproach the problem effectively. By the time she reached the heat peak zone, the interior section of Station 3, where the temperature climbed to its maximum, she had cleared 6 of the 12 cognitive panels. She was moving slower now. The heat was getting to her. Her biometrics were showing the elevated heart rate and core temperature increase that the environment was designed to produce. But she wasn't stopping. She was adapting her pace, conserving energy, choosing each movement with more deliberation. She hit a problem in Passage 7. The passage required a lateral movement sequence that was specifically calibrated for the wider shoulder span of Vreth anatomy. For a human-sized frame, it was geometrically difficult in a way that no amount of technique fully compensated for. The angles simply didn't work. I watched her attempt it twice in the standard way. Twice, she reached the point where the passage geometry became a wall for her body type, and she had to back out. She stopped, stood in front of the passage for almost a full minute. I was tracking her time. She had consumed roughly 18 minutes inside the structure. The time limit was 25. 7 minutes left, and she still had 5 cognitive panels and this passage between her and the exit. She lay down. Not to rest. There was no time for rest. She lay flat on the ground and reassessed the geometry of the passage from a horizontal perspective, and she figured out something that I genuinely had not seen in 6 years of monitoring that station. If you rotated your approach by 90 degrees and moved through the passage laterally on your side, essentially parallel to the ground, the geometry that made it impassable for a smaller frame became navigable. It was slower than the intended approach, but it worked. She went through the passage on her side. She cleared the remaining 5 cognitive panels in 4 minutes and 40 seconds. She exited Station 3 at the 24-minute, 12-second mark. 13 seconds under the limit. I sat in my monitoring station and did nothing for a moment, just sat there. Then I wrote in my log, Station 3 VOS human cleared, method, adaptive, time, under limit. Note, invented a novel passage approach that I have not previously documented. Suggest engineering review of S3 geometry. Hour 16 arrived with the first atmospheric storm. Cathara 9 storms were not gentle things. The pressure differentials that drove them were significant enough to make standing in open terrain actively dangerous, not from precipitation, because the planet's weather system produced very little rain, but from wind shear and the particulate matter it carried. The basalt surface of the trial zone was constantly shedding fine particles that, in storm conditions, created an abrasive airflow that could cause real damage to exposed surfaces over time. The standard approach for cadets caught in a Cathara storm was to find shelter and wait it out. The storms typically lasted between 3 and 5 hours. Most experienced cadets, and the briefing materials made this clear, planned their movement windows around the storm schedule to avoid being caught in open terrain. But the storm schedule was one of the things the trial designers had made unpredictable. The cadets knew storms would happen. They didn't know when. This one caught most of the active cadets in open terrain. Extraction count jumped by 3 in the first hour of the storm. Cadets who had been managing the accumulation of challenges up to that point reached their limit when the storm added another layer. The Borrelian group, which had been moving strongly up to this point, lost 2 of its 4 members to extraction within 90 minutes of the storm beginning. I was watching Senna. She had been moving toward Gauntlet Station 5 when the storm hit. She was in relatively open terrain, not ideal, but she was close to a rock formation cluster that the terrain data flagged as potential shelter. She moved to it immediately. No hesitation, no wasted time assessing whether shelter was the right call. She just moved. The formation wasn't perfect. It gave her a wind break on 2 sides, which protected her from the worst of the shear, but the third side was exposed, and the particulate matter was getting through. I watched her pull the trial suit's hood up and tighten it, cover her face with a piece of the supplementary material from her kit, and then do something that made me look twice at my feed. She started working. She couldn't move forward. The storm made open terrain movement functionally impossible and dangerous enough to risk extraction if she'd tried. But she didn't just sit there waiting for it to end. She pulled out the field assessment unit, and she spent the storm duration, 4 hours and 22 minutes, doing what I can only describe as planning. She mapped every gauntlet station she hadn't reached yet. She cross-referenced the terrain data with the atmospheric information the unit was collecting during the storm. She plotted movement windows that would get her from her current position to the beacon coordinates, and then to the extraction point within the remaining 54 hours, accounting for another potential storm, accounting for the atmospheric distortion arrays cycling back on, accounting for her own physical needs, rest, water, food. She built a plan in 4 hours that most experienced field officers would have taken 8 hours in a proper operations room to put together. And then, when the storm cleared, she stood up, shook the particulate matter off her kit, and started moving. She didn't look like someone who had just spent 4 hours sheltering in a rock formation on a hostile alien world. She looked like someone who had just spent 4 hours getting ready. Hour 23 was when I stopped pretending I was watching this professionally. Let me tell you what happened. There were 18 cadets still active in the trial zone at hour 23. 13 of the original 31 had been extracted by this point. The attrition rate was actually running slightly below the trial average. The cohort this year was strong overall, but the terrain and the compounding challenges were doing their work. Every hour, the accumulated weight of everything Cathara 9 was throwing at the cadets became a little heavier. Senna had cleared 4 gauntlet stations. She was approaching Station 7, which was the midpoint challenge, the one the designers had built to function as the trial's psychological pivot. Not the hardest station physically, not the most cognitively demanding, but the one that was designed to make you doubt yourself. Station 7 presented the cadet with a choice. 2 paths forward. Both legitimate, both would get you to the beacon coordinates and the extraction point within the trial time limit. But only one of them offered the possibility of completing all 12 gauntlet stations. The other path bypassed stations 8 and 9, which reduced the trial completion score significantly, but was faster and less physically demanding. The choice was framed as a simple navigation decision. The cadets had to make it without being explicitly told what they were choosing between. They had to figure that out from the terrain data. Most cadets chose the bypass path. The Academy's records showed that the bypass rate at Station 7 was around 70%. The cadets who chose the full path were the ones who usually ended up at the top of the completion rankings. I watched Senna stand at the Station 7 decision point. She had her field assessment unit out. She was reading the data. I could see on my board that she was running the time calculations. The unit was showing her projected arrival times for each path. The bypass path gave her a comfortable margin. The full path was going to make the remaining hours very hard. She stood there for 6 minutes. And then she chose the full path. Not because she didn't know what it was going to cost her. She knew exactly what it was going to cost her. She just spent 6 minutes calculating it. She chose it anyway. That was the moment I stopped watching professionally. Because I had been monitoring trial cadets for 6 years, and I had learned to keep a certain distance. You couldn't do this job well if you got emotionally invested in every candidate. But there was something about watching a 23-year-old human woman, alone on a planet that was designed to break people, at hour 23 of a 72-hour ordeal, choosing the harder path when the easier one was right there. There was something about that I couldn't watch without feeling something. I'm not sure what to call it exactly. Pride seems too large. Admiration seems too small. It was something in between, a kind of recognition. Like watching someone be exactly who they were, without apology or performance. I made a note in my log. Hour 23, VOS human full path selected, biometrics stable, proceeding. The gauntlet stations on the full path were brutal. Station 8 was a sustained endurance test, the kind that didn't offer any shortcuts or clever adaptations. It simply required you to complete a physical circuit of the station structure within a time limit that was calibrated to push candidates to the edge of their cardiovascular capacity. For most species, it was 2 laps of a demanding course. For humans, the lower oxygen environment made it equivalent to running the same circuit at significant altitude on Earth. Senna completed it. Not easily. Her biometrics through Station 8 were the hardest data I'd seen from her. Heart rate well elevated, oxygen saturation lower than I liked, pace dropping in the final quarter of the circuit as her body started making the kind of trades that bodies make when they're running out of comfortable options. But she completed it. She sat on the ground outside Station 8 for 11 minutes afterward, just sitting, not moving, her biometrics recovering slowly. Then she drank water, ate a portion of the compact nutrition unit from her kit, sat for 3 more minutes, and stood up. Station 9 was the one I'd been watching for, because Station 9 was where the trial had claimed 2 of its most highly rated cadets in recent years. A Vreth prodigy from the 28th intake, and a Kalandri who had been considered the most naturally talented candidate her species had submitted in a generation. Both had failed Station 9 not because of anything specific to the station itself, but because of where it fell in the sequence. By the time you reached Station 9 on the full path, you had already burned through so much reserve capacity that the station's demands, not extraordinary in isolation, became impossible under the cumulative weight of everything that had come before. Station 9 required sustained, precise cognitive performance. After 32 hours of physical and environmental stress, Senna reached Station 9 at hour 31. She looked different than she had at hour 11, when I'd watched her enter Station 3 with those calm, assessing eyes. 31 hours of Cathara 9 had left marks. Her face was drawn. The fatigue was visible even on my optical feed, even from distance. She was moving more carefully than she had been, conserving every step with the efficiency of someone who has learned, through hours of hard experience, exactly how much each step costs. But her eyes were the same. Still that same quality of attention I'd noticed at the launch point, still reading the environment, still thinking. She spent 8 minutes outside Station 9 before entering. 8 full minutes studying it. Not resting, I could see on my feed that she was doing a slow walk around the exterior, the same way she'd done at Station 3. Getting information, building a picture. Then she went in. The cognitive sequence inside Station 9 was long. 12 separate problem sets, each one building on the previous in a chain of logical dependencies that meant a wrong answer early in the sequence cascaded forward and made subsequent problems harder. The trap that most cadets fell into was moving too fast in the early sections, making errors that they didn't recognize until several steps later, and then having to backtrack through the chain while the cognitive fatigue accumulated. Senna moved through the first 3 sequences very slowly. Slower than the other cadets I'd seen attempt this station in the same year. Slow enough that I was checking her time and feeling the first real concern I'd felt for her all trial. But she didn't make a single error in the first 3 sequences. She was moving slowly on purpose, taking the time to verify each step before moving to the next, accepting the time cost up front to avoid the backtracking cost later. By sequence 7, she had built a margin she could work with, and she started moving faster. She cleared Station 9 in 38 minutes. She had 14 seconds to spare. She came out of Station 9, and she sat down on the ground and she put her face in her hands. Not crying. I was watching her biometrics, no elevated emotional distress markers. She was just done. She had spent everything she had on those 38 minutes, and she needed to sit down and acknowledge that. She sat there for 16 minutes. Then she stood up and kept going. I need to tell you about hour 47, because it was the moment the other cadets started noticing her. There were 9 active cadets left in the trial zone at hour 47, 9 out of the original 31. 3 Vreth, 2 Kalandri, 1 Borelian, 1 Thessali, 1 Menhali, and Senna. The Menhali cadet, whose name was Arav, who I had been watching with considerable respect because he was performing extraordinarily well, reached the beacon coordinates at hour 45, retrieved his beacon unit, and was making good time toward the extraction point. Senna reached the beacon coordinates at hour 47. She had to pass through gauntlet stations 10 and 11 to get there, and she had cleared both of them. Station 10, she completed in a time that was good but not exceptional. Station 11, a combined navigation and problem-solving challenge in a low-light environment, she completed in a time that was exceptional by any standard. The darkness seemed to help her somehow. The reduced visual information load that had been a limitation in bright conditions became an advantage when everyone was dealing with limited visibility. At the beacon coordinates, she retrieved her beacon unit, a small, dense device that had to be carried for the remainder of the trial, adding weight and bulk, and she stood for a moment with it in her hands. Around her, the trial zone's terrain stretched in every direction. 47 hours of walking and running and climbing and solving and surviving had brought her to this point. The extraction point was still 16 kilometers away. The final gauntlet station, Station 12, the last one, the hardest one, stood between her and the finish. She had 25 hours left on the clock. She looked around at the terrain. I don't know what she was seeing. I could see her face on my optical feed, but I couldn't know what was going through her mind. Then she looked up. Just for a moment, she looked up at the sky. The amber and violet of Cathara 9 atmosphere, the fast-moving clouds. She looked up at it the way someone looks at something that has been trying to beat them for 2 days and hasn't succeeded yet. And I watched something happen on her face. Not quite a smile, something smaller than a smile, but something real, something that said, "I'm still here." Then she turned toward Station 12 and started walking. The Vreth cadets found her at hour 51. 3 of them moving in a loose group toward the extraction point after retrieving their beacons. Their path crossed Senna's on the western approach to Station 12, and they came up on her from behind. I watched the encounter on my monitoring feed, with more attention than I'd given to anything else in the trial so far. The Vreth were not hostile. The trial wasn't a competitive format. Cadets weren't racing each other, and there were no point-scoring advantages to being faster than other candidates. But they had spent 51 hours on the same planet, enduring the same challenges, and there is a particular language that shared hardship creates between beings who would otherwise have very little in common. The lead Vreth, I checked his file, his name was Sorvin, rated among the top physical performers in the cohort, stopped when he saw Senna, looked at her, looked at the beacon unit she was carrying, looked at the path she was on. He said something in Vreth. I had the translation overlay running on my monitoring station. He said, "You took the full path." Senna looked at him. "Yes." The bypass was the smart choice at 7. She considered that. "Maybe, but I wanted to know if I could do it." Sorvin was quiet for a moment. Then one of the other Vreth said something, translation. She cleared all 12. 11, Senna said. Station 12 is next. Sorvin looked at Station 12 on the terrain. It was visible from where they were standing, a large installation at the top of a rocky rise about 2 kilometers ahead. Then he looked at Senna. "We bypassed 8 and 9, he said. And the way he said it, I'd been around Vreth long enough to hear the register. He wasn't bragging. He was, in his way, making an admission. "That's a valid choice," Senna said. "How are you still standing?" She looked at him steadily. "I stopped thinking about stopping." "I wrote that down." "I stopped thinking about stopping." "I wrote it in my log, and I've thought about it many times since. It's the simplest possible articulation of something that is genuinely very difficult," and she said it with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing how they hold a tool. The Vreth cadets didn't bypass Station 12. They had already collected their beacons. They had enough hours to reach the extraction point without completing it. They chose to enter it anyway. I think, and I have no official evidence for this, it's just what I believe based on what I watched. I think they chose to enter Station 12 because of what Senna had said. They didn't want to think about stopping either. Station 12. Every trial monitoring officer has a story about Station 12. Mine goes like this. Station 12 is not designed to be survived through strength or speed or cognitive performance. It's designed to be survived through one thing, the decision to keep going when every system in your body is telling you to stop. Physically, it's an endurance circuit, similar to Station 8 but significantly longer, and with load-bearing requirements that add to the metabolic cost. The beacon unit you're carrying counts as part of the load. You have to complete the circuit while carrying everything you've accumulated. Cognitively, it runs a continuous problem presentation through the station's interface system, not individual sequences with clear endpoints, but an ongoing stream that you have to manage while also completing the physical circuit. Your score depends on how many you solve correctly, not on a pass-fail threshold. But the real test of Station 12, the part that the designers built intentionally and that the Academy doesn't advertise in the briefing materials, is the environmental element. At the midpoint of the circuit, the station reduces its internal oxygen content. Not dangerously. Safely monitored, with medical override protocols that would trigger extraction if any cadet approached genuine physiological risk. But enough. Enough to make your muscles feel wrong. Enough to slow your thinking. Enough to make the remaining half of the circuit feel like it's being run through water. In a species already adapted for low oxygen environments, the Menhali, for example, the effect is minimal. In species with high metabolic oxygen requirements, it's significant. Humans breathe continuously. They rely on oxygen delivery to muscles in a way that most compact species, with their various biological redundancies and metabolic alternatives, simply don't. Station 12's oxygen reduction hit humans harder than almost any other species. I knew this when Senna walked in. I knew it, and I watched the door close behind her, and I didn't look away from my monitoring feed for the next hour and 42 minutes. The first 20 minutes were fine. The circuit was demanding, but her pace was consistent. She was solving problems on the interface panels as she encountered them, not at her hour 11 speed, which had been impressive, but steadily, making progress. At the 23-minute mark, she passed the midpoint. The oxygen reduction engaged. I watched it hit her. It's subtle on the feed, you can see it in the gate first, a fraction of a % of degradation in stride efficiency, then in the reaction time on the cognitive panels, then, slowly, in the posture. The body starting to redirect resources, pulling from peripheral systems to protect the core. She slowed down. Not dramatically. She didn't stagger or stumble, she just got heavier. Every step became more deliberate, more costly. The cognitive panel response time increased. She made 2 errors in the next 5 minutes, the first errors she'd made since early in the trail. She caught both, corrected them, but the correction time was longer than it would have been an hour ago. At the 40-minute mark she stopped. Not to rest. She stopped at a panel and she stood there and I watched her biometrics. Heart rate was elevated. Core temperature was up. Oxygen saturation was at the lower boundary of safe range for a human under physical exertion in a reduced oxygen environment. And she was making a decision. I could see it in the stillness of her. She was in there, somewhere behind those eyes, having a conversation with herself, with whatever part of her had been doing this for 51 hours, with whatever part of her had said I stopped thinking about stopping. She stood at that panel for 94 seconds. Then she solved the problem on the panel. And she kept going. The next 45 minutes were the hardest thing I have witnessed in 6 years of monitoring the Deathworld trial. Not the most dramatic, not the most technically impressive, but the hardest. She moved through the remaining circuit with a pace that was visibly slower than what she'd entered with. Every step was an expenditure. The cognitive panels took her longer. She made errors and corrected them, made more errors, corrected more. But she didn't stop. She solved 61 of the 82 problems presented in the continuous sequence. Not the highest score ever recorded at Station 12, but the highest score ever recorded by a cadet who had also completed Stations 8 and 9 on the full path. She completed the physical circuit. The door at the far end of the station opened. She walked out. I don't have adequate words for what I felt watching that, so I'll just tell you what I did. I stood up. I stood up at my monitoring station, by myself, with no one else in the room. I don't know why, it just felt like the right thing to do. Hour 68. 4 cadets still active, Sorvin and one other Vreth, Arev the Menhali, and Senna. The extraction point was 2 kilometers ahead of her. She had cleared all 12 gauntlet stations. She was carrying her beacon unit. She had 4 hours left on the clock and 2 kilometers to walk. She was going to make it. I knew it at that point. Barring some catastrophic equipment failure or a medical event that nothing in her biometrics was suggesting, she was going to make it. And yet those last 2 kilometers were the ones I watched most carefully. Because I had seen cadets collapse in the final approach before. Physically and mentally, the body that had held together through everything finally reaching its limit when the finish was in sight. It's a cruel thing, physiologically. The relaxation of sustained effort, the release of whatever chemical resolve had been keeping systems running past their normal limits. Sometimes just seeing the end was enough to let the body stop. Senna walked those 2 kilometers in 46 minutes. Slowly, with a care in every step that spoke to exactly how much each one was costing her, but steadily, head up, eyes forward. The Vreth cadets were already at the extraction point when she arrived. They had a faster pace over those last kilometers and had beaten her by about 20 minutes. Arev had arrived first, at hour 65. The Menhali was sitting on a supply crate near the extraction pad when Senna came into the perimeter. I was watching through the extraction point cameras now. The monitoring system had close-range optical arrays at every extraction pad, and I had switched to those when she entered the final approach. She came through the perimeter marker, and she stopped. She looked at the extraction pad, at the other cadets, at the academy monitoring structure at the edge of the pad. Then she did something I hadn't seen from her in 68 hours of watching her. She smiled. Not a triumphant smile, not a performative "I won" expression. Just a quiet, private, completely genuine smile that broke slowly across her exhausted face like she just remembered something good that she'd almost forgotten. Sorvin was standing near the pad. He saw her come through the perimeter. He turned toward her, and I watched him do something that Vreth do when they're acknowledging another being standing, a particular positioning of the arms, the secondary set raised and then brought down slowly. It's a formal gesture in Vreth culture, used between warriors who have proven themselves to one another in the same field. He gave it to a human girl who had just walked through 72 hours of a world designed to break her. She stood in front of him and received it, and then she said something. I couldn't hear it through the camera feed. The external audio pickup at that distance wasn't calibrated for quiet speech. But I watched Sorvin's face when she said it, and something shifted in his expression. Something that, on a Vreth face, is hard to read but unmistakable if you've been watching them long enough. Something like respect, the real kind, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself. She walked to the edge of the pad and sat down, put the beacon unit carefully beside her, looked up at the Cathara 9 sky one more time, and waited for the extraction transport. I filed my monitoring report on the 30-second intake trial 3 days later. It was the longest report I had written in 6 years, not because the trial had been more complex than others. In terms of candidate count and event density, it was fairly typical, but because there was so much I felt needed to be documented accurately. Completion statistics: 4 cadets from 31, a completion rate of 12.9%, slightly above the historical average. Final standings: Arev the Menhali in first, Senna Voss in second, Sorvin in third, and one other Vreth cadet in fourth. Second place. Out of a cohort of 31 cadets representing 7 species, including species that had been submitting candidates to this trial for decades. Second place for the first human candidate in the history of the Deathworld trial. I wrote the objective numbers. Then I wrote the analysis section, which is where monitoring officers are given latitude to describe patterns and behaviors that the raw data doesn't fully capture. I wrote about the southeastern approach and what it said about her planning horizon. I wrote about the distortion array adaptation, about Station 3's passage and the novel solution she'd invented, about the choice at Station 7, about the words she said to Sorvin. I stopped thinking about stopping. I wrote about Station 12, about the 94 seconds she stood at the panel and had that conversation with herself, about what the biometrics showed during those 94 seconds, because they were interesting, and I thought the Academy should know about them. Her heart rate had not decreased during those 94 seconds. Her oxygen saturation had not improved. Nothing in her physiological readings suggested she had recovered anything in that time. What had changed at the end of those 94 seconds was something in the neural activity pattern that my monitoring station picked up through the suit's biometric sensors. A pattern I had seen documented in research on human decision-making under duress. A pattern that corresponds, in the literature, to what researchers call the point of commitment, the neurological moment when deliberation ends and action begins. She hadn't rested at that panel. She had decided. And then she had acted on the decision. I wrote all of that, and then I wrote the final line of my report, which I spent about an hour composing, and which I will not pretend was strictly professional in its register. Cadet Senna Voss, human, Earth, presents a profile that challenges several foundational assumptions about human viability in extreme trial environments. Her performance is not attributable to any single exceptional capability. She has no physical, sensory, or cognitive advantage over the non-human cadets in this cohort. What she demonstrated over 72 hours is something different, a sustained, principled refusal to be stopped by anything the environment or the trial design presented to her. I have monitored 32 intakes. I have watched cadets from 11 species attempt this trial. I do not have a category for what I observed in Cadet Voss. I suggest the Academy may need to develop one. Epilogue. I saw her once more, about 6 weeks after the trial. She was walking across the Academy courtyard with a field assignment briefing folder in her hands. She had the same practical haircut, the same quality of attention in her eyes, watching the environment, reading it, thinking. I don't know if she noticed me. I don't think she would have recognized me if she had. Monitoring officers are largely invisible to cadets during a trial, which is the point. But I watched her walk across that courtyard, and I thought about something one of my colleagues had said when I told them about her performance. He was an older Borrelian, with more years in academy service than I had been alive, and he had an economy of language that I had always admired. When I described what Senna had done on Cathara 9, the full path, Station 12, the 94 seconds, the final 2 kilometers, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The universe has a way of producing what it needs, usually in forms nobody expected." I've thought about that a lot. Because the galaxy had spent decades building the Deathworld trial to break exceptional beings, it had tested the strong and the fast and the gifted and the foresighted. It had found the limits of species after species. It had become, in a way, a monument to limitation, a place that existed to prove how hard the universe was and how much it cost to navigate it. And then a 23-year-old human woman from a remote homestead in Manitoba, Canada, walked in carrying nothing extraordinary except the decision to keep going. And Cathara 9, for the first time in a long time, felt like it had met something it couldn't fully account for. Not a species built for hardship. A person who had simply decided that hardship was not a reason to stop. That, in the end, is what I can't stop thinking about. Not the statistics, not the rankings, not the exceptional things she did along the way, the clever approaches, the novel solutions, the consistent performance. Just that. The decision. That quiet, private, completely personal decision to keep going. Made alone on a hostile world, with no one watching who could help. Just a girl and the planet, and the choice between what was hard and what was harder. She chose harder. Every time,